welcome everybody to this webinar on breaking down barriers to pupil engagement with school. I'll begin by introducing myself, and then I'll hand over to the expert panelists joining us for today's discussion to briefly introduce themselves. So my name is Cath Bansal. I am the Head of Public Affairs at Ambition Institute and Deputy Festival Director for the Festival of Education. I have had various roles in education, including policy lead on exclusions and internal alternative provision at the Centre for Social Justice, and prior to that as an education journalist at Schools Week and FE Week. Today I'll be chairing our panel, and I'd like to ask our panellists to introduce themselves. I'll start with you, Steph.
Thanks, Cath. Hi, everyone. I'm Steph Hamilton. I'm the director for TEP, or the engagement platform, which is part of the Impact Ed group. Prior to doing this, I worked at the education charity, the Brilliant Club, and way back in the day was a science teacher in a former life.
Brilliant. Thanks, Steph. Mohamed, could I ask you to come in next?
Thanks, Cath. So my name is Mohamed Abdallah. I am the head of the Inclusive Leadership course at The Difference. I also lead on our internal AP network too. And also in my former life, I was a senior leader who oversaw inclusion, safeguarding and attendance in an all-through mainstream school. So that's me. Thanks,
Mohamed. Great to have you with us today. Bennie, could I ask you to introduce yourself next?
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm Bennie Cara. In a former life, I was also a teacher for 20 years, an English teacher. I now write, speak, consult and train on all aspects curriculum, and in particular diversity, equity and inclusion. And I am the writer of some books on those topics.
Fantastic. Thanks, Bennie. Now, last but not least, we have our very own Steve Farndon.
Thanks, Cath. Yeah, I'm an associate director at Ambition Institute. In my former life, I was a secondary history teacher. I now, amongst other things, lead our pupil engagement programme. So that's why I'm here today.
Thanks, everyone. It's fantastic to be joined by 4 leading voices in the sector, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion. We will also be sharing some links to some recent research, some publications, and a relevant event at the end of the webinar, so do stay tuned for that. To kick us off, though, I'm going to hand over to Steph, whose organisation, the Engagement Platform, have recently completed a groundbreaking study on pupil engagement in schools in partnership with Impact Ed. This is the first study of this scale conducted on a nationwide level, and its findings will inform much of our discussion this afternoon. So over to you, Steph.
Right, can you see that, Cath, just to check? Fantastic. So lovely to speak to you all, and thank you so much to Ambition for inviting us along to talk about our research. So TEP is incubated by the Impact Ed group. TEP supports school leaders to collect, analyse, benchmark and act on school engagement data. And I'm going to talk you through some of the first data that we have collected from our national census that we kicked off in the autumn. When we're talking about school engagement, we're really looking at the overall commitment, involvement and that emotional investment that an individual has with a school or education setting. So we're not necessarily measuring, does this specific pupil love maths and is engaged in their lesson? We're really thinking about that overarching kind of commitment and excitement about coming to school. And why do we think this is important? So we have been looking at the wider literature, but also looking at our own research over the last few years. And we know that understanding engagement is a good lead indicator of outcomes. So focusing in here, we know that high pupil engagement is a great lead indicator of attendance, progress, and that positive school experience. And what we're looking at when we're measuring this is we're measuring cognitive engagement, so what people think, emotional engagement, how do they feel. Those both feed into behavioural engagement, so how are people actually acting. And in our model, we know that this feeds into and is a predictor of those intermediate and those longer term outcomes. So, for example, what we can see with some of our employee engagement data that we've been looking at for the last few years is engagement dips before staff attrition starts to dip. So we can now use our data to identify potential staff leavers up to 9 months early. And when we're talking about this with pupils, and what we've seen in some of the international data is we can see that this engagement level dips before that attendance dips and before you see some of the kind of lag in attainment that we desperately want to avoid as a sector. So I'm going to take you through some of the very quick insights from our national census that we conducted in the autumn. There is so much data coming out of this. There's not going to be, it would take you far too long to kind of go through it all. So do get in touch if you do want to hear some more and read some of the research we're publishing. But we undertook this research with just under 120,000 pupils in 3 weeks across November. 200 schools that took part, and we had a really high response rate from those that took part, so it was around 82%. And the spread of schools that we looked at were very representative of the national population and spread of schools and types of schools that we have across the UK. We started getting into the grips of some of this in December, and the results were really quite sobering and maybe a slightly depressing way to end the year. Because really what we have seen is the engagement levels are not where we want them to be. We see a huge drop as you go from year 7 to year 8. And as soon as we start to measure engagement all the way back from year 3, which is the youngest age group that we measure, we can see this engagement start to decline. But we have this cliff edge moment between year 7 and year 8. It does recover slightly as you get into year 11, but it never goes back to that level that we see at the beginning of primary school. Their sense of enjoyment really mirrors this as well. So the patterns are kind of reflected. Lots of children indicate that they really don't enjoy school. And what we kind of looked at, and if you can see this table, 23% of pupils that responded to the census reported kind of happiness about going to school of a score of kind of 1 or 2 out of 10. So having an extreme reaction to some of those happiness about going to schools. So when we're looking at that, that really represents tens of thousands of pupils underneath that. And we have had a very initial look at how this compares to the international setting as well. So these aren't the exact same measures, but they're the closest equivalent in terms of measuring sense of belonging and value of school and happiness. And we do see this decline in the international data set. So this is using TIMSS. But we can see that this decline is more extreme when we're looking at England. And we are going to be doing some further comparison studies in this area. And we also looked at whether is this just pupils getting grumpier as they age? Is this an age kind of issue? So what we did was group together those pupils who are closest in age. So here I've just pulled out year 7 autumn-born pupils and year 8 summer-born pupils. And what we can see is their scores are much more closely aligned to the year group that they're sat in, as opposed to their chronological age. So it's something about that collective experience they're having within their year group as they move through school that is affecting this overall engagement and those drivers of engagement. One of the drivers that we look at is that sense of value of school. And what we can see is around a quarter of pupils in England to some extent question whether what they're learning at school is going to be important and help them in the future. So we also kind of can see that difference playing out between primary, secondary and post-16. So primary, again, we're seeing higher levels of kind of value of school and engagement that dip down during secondary, so 11 to 16, and post-16, a slight recovery in some of those areas. But certainly something that we need to work on and concentrate on the kind of what are the levers that we can pull to address some of this. We also started to break this down in terms of different ethnic groups, and kind of specifically looking at the differences in drive and agency. And we see this pattern of decline from primary to secondary reflected in those drivers. And specifically, we can see that white pupils have a much lower sense of agency and drive all the way through, but we also see that having the most significant decline in that sense of drive and agency as you get from year 6 to year 8. We also see this also reflected in trust of teachers, but this is where we start to see a slightly different pattern, with black pupils much less likely than their white peers to trust their teachers and have somebody that they can talk to. And we also start to see this difference between pupils who have a more thorough kind of intensive support plan, so have an EHCP in place, compared to those pupils who just have some level of SEN support and monitoring. This is just the beginning of some of this research, and what we're kind of looking forward to doing is comparing that November data to the spring census that is currently underway. So we are collecting from the same cohorts of pupils, and we're going to be able to look at what point in the year does this engagement start to decline. So that big drop off between year 7 and 8, are we only going to see that effect when we get into the autumn? Or are we going to be able to start seeing that drop off at this point in the year? We're going to be then matching some of this engagement data to attendance. We're going to be doing some deeper dives into inclusion and ethnicity, looking at some of the interplay between pupil and the employee engagement data that we've been collecting for the last 3 years. There is a really exciting family engagement pilot that we're going to be having coming up, and also looking at some more international comparison groups that we're starting to pilot as well. So lots of really interesting data to come, but hopefully enough to begin our discussion and some of the questions that we are going to put on the table in this session. So I'm going to unshare and back over to you, Cath.
Thanks so much, Steph. That provides some really fascinating insights for us to dig into. Great starter for the discussion, thank you. So we're now going to move on to our panel discussion, and I'd like to open it up by asking some of our panelists, just to start with, how far does what we've just heard align with your experience? So Mohamed, can I start with you? The difference has been working with mainstream and alternative provision schools for 6 years now. So what are you seeing and hearing about pupil engagement in the schools that you work with?
Yeah, I mean, this strongly resonates with our experience during our program. So the inclusive leadership course that I lead and facilitate, but also our kind of different schools partnership program, where we're doing kind of deeper implementation work with schools. We're seeing a lot of these trends ourselves, and we frequently hear about some of these challenges in relation to student engagement. The difference, we refer to it as kind of losing learning, and the students who tend to be losing learning. But there's one school in particular I'm thinking about. So hearing Steph talk about kind of the attendance drop, especially from year 7 to year 8. There's one school in the southwest where we're working around attendance in particular, especially around kind of persistent absenteeism. And their trend over the past 2-3 years has been the kind of dip in attendance from year 7 into year 8. And then digging into this kind of data a bit more, and trying to get under the bonnet, what we also identify, and Steph this will kind of reaffirm what you've been presenting as well, that girls tend to make up the kind of significant proportion of that data group as well. And then we dig a little bit deeper, and then we find some of the kind of underlying concerns there around kind of mental health and other medical concerns as well. So we're supporting leaders to really think about this data kind of diagnostically, and how they respond to that data, especially around attendance and also kind of suspensions. There is kind of a broader challenge here as well. It's really interesting to kind of see that slide around kind of enjoyment of school. I do wonder, I'm trying not to be too controversial here, if we're asking the right question. You know, is enjoyment of school the question that we should be asking? And of course, I want children to enjoy school and students to enjoy school. But instead, how do we ensure students feel like that they are significant and they matter in school, I think is the question, because depending on the question we ask, I think our response could be slightly different. And so I'm much more interested in kind of disengagement tends to speak to me, and this is what I speak to our leaders on the course about kind of a lack of significance or kind of mattering in school and their community too. So yeah, it definitely resonates with us, especially around kind of safety in school as well, and engaging with student voice to really understand why the data in schools that really reflects what Steph has presented here is emerging in the schools that we're working in.
Thanks, Mo, for sharing that. Before I move on to Bennie, can I just check, Steph, would you like a right of reply on any of that? Is there any nuance that wasn't covered in your short presentation that you can bring to what the challenge that Mohamed just gave you?
Yeah, so I mean, we were also seeing really similar patterns with gender. So, you know, I think specifically around that sense of safety, trust of teachers, but trust of peers as well. So seeing, and you know, that the drop that we see, that really is the drop that opens up between year 7 and 8, and you know, happens in key stage 3 really. So there's actually some blogs that we can send everyone to have a look at some of that data. The other interesting thing was around enjoyment. So I think this is the sort of trade-off, and I think, you know, we all do want people to enjoy school, but where does that come in terms of priorities and importance when we're thinking about our school improvement plans and achievement? We're wanting to dig into this because we want to understand the dynamics of this better. Our initial analysis is those schools that achieve more highly have much higher enjoyment scores. It's correlation right now, it is not causation, but I think it is an early indicator that this is something we can't ignore. We have to think about, you know, that excitement and that enjoyment and that joy, like I think that sense of joy walking into a school building for them to get the most out of the kind of talents of the teachers that they're going to be sat in front of. So yeah, I think it kind of resonated with me, Mohamed, what you were saying, and I think this, you know, there's just more questions. The more we talk about this, the list grows with what we want to dig into here.
Brilliant, thanks, Steph, for adding that. And I'll move on to Bennie next, but I just want to note for Steve, there's an interesting point there. I know that in the research report that you've just pulled out, that might be able to speak to some of that idea about student motivation, how it's correlated with achievement. So I look forward to inviting you to come in after Bennie. But Bennie, can I just ask you about, is there anything you'd like to add about what you're seeing in schools? And then also drawing on your own knowledge of the research, please kind of do share if you've got any reasons, or you can kind of help us understand some of the reasons why you think pupils might be disengaging.
Absolutely. It's fascinating to see the outcomes of the research. And I think back to very early in my career, 20 years ago, as a classroom teacher, without this research, we knew that something was happening in year 8. We used to talk about it as the year that everything fell apart for our key stage 3 pupils. And of course, now we have looked at the evidence in that. And one of the things that I'm conscious of, and I see very much of, is the transition between primary and secondary is particularly tricky. You go from being known, feeling a sense of belonging and pride. You know, you get your leavers jumpers and you're part of a cohort, and you go into a student soup at secondary, and relationships are much harder to navigate with staff. And it's interesting that trust comes up highly as a factor. And of course, when you are trusting in one person at primary to be your champion, and then you lose that and you go into secondary, you're filled with hope and optimism in that first year. And in that second year, you recognize, no, actually, I've got several different relationships. They're all different. And the pressure is on. And one of the things that we can look at is whether we spend enough time on that transition period around getting to know our young people. there was some DERA research from 2008, so quite a long time ago now, that talked about secondary teachers not having enough knowledge of the young people who are likely to become disaffected. So where there are signs in primary school that a student might be part of that particular trajectory, not enough information being passed up to secondary. And of course, you have the added factor of decreased comms between school and home at secondary, and potentially an over-reliance on a one-size-fits-all approach at secondary, which, you know, at primary you tend not to have so much on. But the going back to that trust issue, where research has shown that boys report higher levels of trust, they are also much more confident than girls. Now, the data on girls wasn't put up on the screen, but it's stark, the difference between girls and boys. And the European Social Survey, which was run by Roehampton in 2020, showed that boys dominate classroom discussions at secondary and are much more likely to receive positive feedback. Girls participate less, are interrupted more, which hinders their confidence, and they have more negative feedback. Now, I found this fascinating. It really correlates with some of the research around interruptions, lowering of confidence, lowering that sense of self. But the research calls it the political confidence gap, the ability to advocate for yourself. So yes, it's really, really not unexpected that the research shows this, but we can start to unpick some of those reasons why, and there is research out there that shows us.
Brilliant, thank you, Bennie. Yeah, really appreciate all those insights. Steve, I'm going to move on to you now. You've written a paper on pupil engagement recently, and I was in the audience at a CST annual conference when you presented this first in November. And what struck me at the time was we did a bit of a talk and turn, and I was next to a head teacher who said to me, "Oh, this is giving me the evidence for what I and my senior leaders already know, but we don't, you know, it helps me to go back to my school and say, it's okay, the things that you're thinking, there's evidence behind all this stuff." So I'd love you to come in a little bit on that question of the correlation between, or the relationship between student happiness, motivation, and its relationship with learning. And then please feel free to just riff more generally on your report findings.
Thanks, Cath. I think all of the kind of things that have been described so far are indicative of just the amount of information coming at teachers and school leaders on a daily basis about their kids' experience of school, and trying to make sense of what's happening in a school environment and interpret what's happening and then respond appropriately is really, really difficult, especially when the school's moving at 1 million miles an hour. And so one of the things that we try and do as an organisation is provide frameworks of evidence that allow teachers and school leaders to interpret what's happening and then select an appropriate response. And so when we started hearing, in the same way that Mohamed has done, from schools saying, we've got a problem here, like, what do we do about it? We turned to self-determination theory, which is a theory of human motivation and engagement, to understand what factors affect and determine how people become more or less motivated over time, which is really relevant to this question of, why are kids motivated in primary school and yet they're not? The same kids are not motivated in secondary. And the self-determination theory says everyone has 3 basic psychosocial needs. The first is for relatedness, and that's really what Bennie and Mohamed have been talking and really kind of unpicking for us. That idea that in primary school you have a small class, you have a consistent teacher, you're known, like people really know you as an individual, and then, as Bennie said, you end up in the soup of secondary school, and you might become much more anonymous. And then when your need for relatedness, your need to feel like you are seen, known, and valued in that environment is not met, you start to become less motivated. You start to care less about coming to school. I think what's crucial about this, though, and what I find really helpful about self-determination theory, is that it doesn't just focus on relatedness. It also focuses on kids' need for competence and autonomy. So the competence bit, I think, is the thing that you're referring to, Cath, which is Steph's point about, well, what's the relationship between joy in learning and achievement? And the best evidence, as far as I understand it, is that it's reciprocal. You know, if we start to do quite well at something, we quite enjoy it, so we do it more and we get better at it, and then we enjoy it more, and then we get into a really like virtuous cycle of enjoyment and attainment. And so I'm not surprised by that finding, Steph. I mean, it'll be interesting to dig into it further, but you know, that's a big function of schools that schools are really aware of, that they want to help kids learn well. I think the final psychosocial needs autonomy, and in the case of self-determination theory, it doesn't mean choice. It means that you feel like what you're being asked to do isn't arbitrary. So the expectations that an environment has of you have a good reason behind them, and that could be with what you're expected to learn or how you're expected to behave. And I think when Steph was talking about the relevance and value of learning, those are clear signals to me that something isn't right with autonomy support in secondary school. I don't think it's that schools haven't got a good reason for the things that they ask kids to learn. What I think might be happening is, in a really packed curriculum, teachers don't feel they've got the time to explain that to kids and help them to understand it. And so kids feel like perhaps, you know, this stuff that I'm being asked to learn isn't relevant to me, or I can't see the value of it, which then, once again, when you feel like your needs and interests are being ignored systematically over time, you become less motivated. You know, this environment isn't for me. It's not kind of helping me to learn the things I want to learn. So yeah, I think in my view, and you probably expect me to say this, I think self-determination theory is a really useful lens to view these findings through, and then also potentially suggest actions that we could take to tackle them.
Thanks very much, Steve. Steph, I'm just going to ask you to come in and just ask if you've got any ideas from the research about some of the reasons behind. You might not be at that stage yet, and I realise this is your first kind of interim report. But one of the questions that's also come through on the chat was whether there's any correlation with puberty. I don't know if you've been able to look at that in the data.
Yeah, so it is fairly early on. So what we're really going to be getting into when we've got this second round of data is be able to see how these individual pupil responses change over time, and then we can dig deeper into some of the school context, school settings that influence maybe those engagement scores. And specifically what we're going to be doing is looking at those schools and that are beating the national kind of benchmarks for that particular census window, to start to unpick, okay, their year 8s are completely outperforming national. What's happening there? What can we capture within the context of what that school is? And that is going to help us start to unpick, well, how can we build this evidence and case studies? And this is what we'll be putting in that final report in June. So watch this space for us looking at unpicking that. But we are also looking down the various rabbit holes of looking at, you know, the effect of puberty, age, different school types, sizes, curriculum, all of those things that we're looking to unpick. So I think it's early days. Our initial look at kind of what the effect of puberty is, I think we suspect there's not going to be as big a jump there, because what we're seeing, you know, if you look at the age comparison, maybe that's the closest one. So we're seeing it's much more about kind of that experience, and we know that puberty doesn't necessarily all happen at the same point in time, especially for different genders and for people. So I think we're probably going to see quite a spread of that effect, maybe across secondary. But I think it is still going to be a thread that we pull on. But I think it's maybe much more practical for us to look at what are we doing to those pupils. And I think it goes back to that relatedness, that sense of community, that sense of belonging. There are levers here that we can pull, and we know that because there are schools outperforming others in some of these areas. So I think that's where we can begin.
Fantastic. Thanks, Steph. I'm going to move on to a question to Mohamed, but I just wanted to interject with something that's come in from one of the audience questions, and please do keep putting questions in the chat. It's really great to have this interaction. I just want to throw it in there, not specifically for the panelists to answer necessarily yet, but just to keep in mind in case any of you, it sparks with you. A really great question talking about what Bennie said about those trusting relationships at secondary, and thinking about if we have low retention rates of staff, could this possibly be a negative factor because you haven't got those relationships? And then a suggestion that to improve attendance of students, if schools are prioritising staff welfare and retention, so we're looking at staff happiness, so we're looking at reporting of staff happiness and making sure that's a really key factor in the school, could that also be a lever to improve the student experience. So just something for people to think of, and please feel free to come in on that question and weave it into whatever response you're giving. Mohamed, can I just ask you about what your framework is at the difference for thinking about this question, and how you support teachers and school leaders as well to improve pupil engagement through your work?
Yeah, of course, Cath. And that, I mean, there's a lot coming through here, which I'm going to try and kind of unpick. But I'm going to just pick up from Steph, who was just talking about kind of belonging and community, because this is a kind of key theme around our work at The Difference as well, around how we engage students through kind of their assets, engage families through their assets as well, and I guess reframe how we think about our community. So shifting from those who perhaps are disengaged as kind of deficits or a kind of quote unquote broken, and somehow we need to fix them, and rather engaging them with kind of the assets that we see in them. And there's a kind of a significant reframing that we need to do here around shifting kind of staff perception of students who are not necessarily engaging in school, and the families as well, of those children. And so what we're deeply focused on is kind of professional development of staff. So professional development of leaders on our course, but how they cascade that learning across their schools. And we particularly focus on the practice of staff. What do kind of interactions look like between staff and students and families as well? And some of, I guess, kind of the, I guess, key themes, and three key themes that stand out for me tend to be, I guess, kind of lack of voice. Right, so we talk about kind of engaging with the student experience and understanding the student experience in school, and often what we find with schools is that their student voice activity can be quite symbolic but not necessarily meaningful. What does it look like to really engage with student voice in a way where students can see that their experiences, their reflections, their input in school has a tangible impact and effect on the school? So if we want students to really feel like they are part of a community and genuine stakeholders, then they need to be able to also shape the experience that they have in school as well, rather than kind of be passive recipients of kind of their school experience. The second is around kind of relationships as well, and Bennie and Steve have both talked at length about relationships too, and the role of connection. And it's both kind of those adult relationships, but also really meaningful and affirming peer relationships as well. Do students understand what good, strong peer relationships look like and feel like, that enable one another to feel like they are significant in school as well? A key, lastly, like the third thing, which for me is a key thing, is around participation. Students, and this is my, I guess, my kind of bugbear with the word belonging and the term belonging, which can often feel quite passive, is that if we want students to really feel significant and like they matter, they need to be active agents and participants in their school experience. And so what ways do we find to engage students actively in their school community so that their absence is really felt by the school? And so not only do they feel valued, they add value as well. And I think that for me is a really key thing here. Can we honestly say every child in our school adds value to our school? And do those children know that too? So I'm trying to avoid, because there are loads of other factors, socio-economic factors and kind of poverty and so on. And I don't want to ignore all of that. But if we were to just push that kind of impossible thing to the side, I do think we need to really think about, do our children feel like they matter in school? And if they do, how do we create mechanisms to show that they can participate, they can be heard, they can add value? And can I just add one thing, Cath, which is around the internal AP work that we do with schools, and we have a network of just under 200 school leaders who oversee internal AP. Good internal AP does this really well. You find children who have been marginalized in their schools for quite some time, or perhaps during their transition, who finally find themselves in a space where suddenly they do feel like they can actively contribute. They are building meaningful relationships. Their voice is being heard. So how do we replicate what happens in really good internal AP in schools, or kind of flexible kind of curriculum and spaces in schools across a wider school? And that's what I'm really interested in, that kind of improving the significance of children in school so that they feel like they can actively contribute.
Thanks, Mohamed. I think that is it's a big theme as well with the government, isn't it? Talking more about inclusive mainstream with regard to children at risk of exclusion, but also children with special educational needs, and the push from the government to find ways to create inclusive spaces within mainstream. And know that, as you said, you're leading a network of internal AP to kind of pull out good practice from that and share it. And I know you've got plans to share that more widely, which is fantastic. And at Ambition, we're doing a similar thing with enhanced provision communities, running a community of practice where we're drawing examples of really good practice and with enhanced provision for children with STEM. And we're seeing, I know that from our conversations with you and your colleagues at the Difference, Mohamed, we're seeing some similarities actually in the principles of what good provision looks like for children with STEM and then children at risk of exclusion in those kind of internal units, or whatever whatever we call those as provisions. So yeah, watch this space on that. For now, can I bring in you, Bennie, just to respond to that question about staff, because we've heard from Mohamed some things that staff can do to help children, but we had that question which was about what can actually school leaders do for staff to make sure they're in a position to be able to build those relationships.
I think it's hugely important for teachers to feel like they matter. And, you know, Mo's term there, I think, is absolutely nail on the head. Everybody needs to feel like they matter, that they are significant. And again, I think, you know, we've had so many teachers over the years who have stopped feeling like they've mattered because policy and practice don't necessarily include them. I'm thinking about the statistics, particularly on women leaving the profession between the ages of 30 and 39. And the maternity teacher, paternity teacher project has really highlighted that. And schools are responsible for ensuring that their policy and practices make sure that staff stay in the building. So, you know, we talk about equity and equality of opportunity and abiding by the Equality Act, but lots of schools have policies on this, but not necessarily practice. So what happens if you are an LGBT member of staff and you're experiencing homophobia? Is that the right place for you to stay? Potentially not. So I think schools need to be a bit more incisive about what matters to their staff to ensure that their staff matter, and that's around staff voice. And you know, the research on the correlation between teacher unhappiness and lack of student engagement is highlighted by Loic Menzies' work for UCL. Some really interesting points of comparison. You know, unhappy staff leads to turnover, leads to poorer student engagement. I can put the link in the chat in the minute. So for me, you know, if we are going to keep that trust, keep that relational practice going, we have to ensure that staff are in a position to be able to bring their whole selves, to be respected, to understand that if they want to have children or don't want to have children, that they will have roles in schools, that the transition back from maternity is smooth and not just a paper exercise. And crucially around staff safety, you know, female teachers reporting increases in sexualized language towards them, feeling unsafe, and it correlates with how young girls in schools are feeling. You know, the research shows that they are much more subject to that kind of behavior as they head into secondary school. So it's a really complex picture, but ultimately we're saying happy staff equals happier students. And I'm sure we've all been in settings where that is the case. And I defer to Stephanie's point about, you know, is it higher performing schools that have happier children? Well, I imagine, and I am speculating here, that higher performing schools have happier staff because they feel more secure. There is a sense of mattering, and therefore they pass that feeling on to the students.
Thanks, Bennie. Appreciate that. So we've heard different solutions there, some from Mohamed, some from Bennie, more focused on staff. Steve, can I bring you in on the solutions point as well? What kind of things are you recommending from the research that you've done that staff can do to improve pupil engagement?
I think I'm a bit like Mohamed in that there's lots of things I could say. I'm going to have to hold myself back a little bit. I think what the really clear evidence that we do have is that when we are able to work with staff on their day-to-day interactions with students, we get a load of positive benefits. So how they maintain a firm, polite and respectful tone with their students, how they show an interest and understand the kind of needs of their students. How there's actually a question that's just come up in the Q&A about how we make kids feel like they matter. Well, it can be the kind of big gestures that schools can make, at certain key times in the year, or like student voice, but it can also be on a lesson by lesson basis. So there's a whole body of research into autonomy supportive teaching, which is all about how teachers can try and understand their students' perspective and their students' interests, and then make stronger reference to those things whilst they are communicating learning. And these aren't huge changes to practice, but what they do is incrementally over time is they let the kids know that their perspective is listened to and it matters, and that the learning is relevant. And I think in terms of that issue around staff satisfaction, there's a few, there's kind of been some really robust studies that show a lot of benefits. So the first one is, it seems like in terms of job satisfaction, the most important relatedness for staff is with their students. So if we can support staff to have more positive interactions with their classes, their sense of relatedness is likely to be enhanced. But we also have really good evidence to say that where staff can support kids' needs for autonomy, so they can gather from the class their needs and interests and get to know them better and incorporate those into teaching, their satisfaction and enjoyment of their work is massively improved. And presumably that's because instead of feeling like they're trying to impose a curriculum on a group of disinterested students, they're instead working in collaboration with the kids towards a shared endeavour. That really means that the job of teaching feels very different, on that basis. It's also worth saying a few things. So one is,
sorry, Steve, before you move on to anything more theoretical, can I ask you to give a couple of examples, or one example even, because you did mention the term autonomy supportive practice, and I'm not sure that that's instantly easy to grasp. Have you got an example of what that looks like in the classroom?
Yeah. So there's kind of 5 autonomy supported teaching practices that sit under that name. One of them is provide rationales. So sometimes teachers make the assumption that kids know why they're studying what they're studying. And if by simply saying, here's what we're learning today, here's how it relates to what we've learned previously, that's a good starting point. But if they really know their kids, then they can talk about why the particular children in that class might find it interesting. You were asking me this question 2 weeks ago. Well, we're now actually going to answer it today. So I think that's one example where the teacher is taking into account the kid's perspective and responding to that perspective over time and kind of helping them internalize new sources of motivation. And I was just going to say that where teachers are able to better relate to their classes and build that sense of mutual trust, the people who seem to benefit most are those kids who otherwise are disenfranchised. So in America, where this happens, we have a big pattern, the pattern that Steph spoke about earlier, where Black children have low trust with school. These initiatives work really well to kind of overcome that lack of trust in school. So there's a lot of promise that the kids who most need it benefit most from working with teachers on their day-to-day interactions.
Thank you. And I realise for all of our participants today, there's so much to cover, and there's so many concepts as well as practices. So don't despair if it feels like you're just getting a spattering of everything. We will be sharing at the end links to reports where you can dig into this in more detail. Also recommendations, the courses that the various participants might be running to show you places you can sign up to get more information and find out more. So we will be giving you more information. But Mo, can I just ask you to come in as well? And I wonder if you've got any examples or case studies or stories of a school that you've worked with to kind of improve pupil engagement. So you can give us a bit of an example of what that looks like in practice.
Of course, yeah. So there's one school in particular in the north that we have done some work with, who were experiencing some real challenges around attendance and suspensions with the kind of Romani traveller community in their school. And they did this piece of work around recognizing kind of the assets of students and their families in their local community. So this initially started with a student and family voice activity. So really engaging with, it was roughly around 40 families, and understanding their experience of engaging with the school and I guess kind of the system essentially. And what was really kind of interesting about that piece of work that they did with that community and also with the families was that some of the preconceived ideas that they had about the reasons why the attendance was low, assumptions about families not really valuing education, was completely blown out the water, because 100% of the families had said, we actually really value education, we really want them to learn, we want them to be engaged, but we just don't know how to engage with school, we don't really understand the system, we don't understand where the opportunities are, etc. But equally within this activity, they were asking what they were good at, and to understand a bit more about their culture. So they understood kind of the importance of arts and music and etc. And understood what was happening within their community. And so what they did was they brought this in-house. They began to celebrate the Romani traveller community quite visibly in the school. So children who walked in the school could see that their culture and I guess their own cultural capital was being reflected within the school just through kind of display boards and so on. They were asked to be part of some of their kind of arts and music showcases, which hadn't happened previously. And kind of prior to this, you'd had kind of zero attendance of families to their kind of end of year kind of art showcases and so on, to a significant increase of families attending because their children were now being represented, showing kind of the arts of their culture and so on. They saw a significant drop in suspensions to zero. They would see attendance rise to 100% on a Friday, where it would usually drop because what they had was they had people from the community come in and run enrichment activities during lunch. But what this had said, I guess, was messaging to those children in the school was that you are part of our community, you are relevant, you are significant in our community, and we are listening and we're interested in who you are and your identity coming in. And what this did in turn, I think, was increase their engagement with a place that they felt like they were actively engaged with, and I guess I'm trying not to use the word belong, but I have to use it. They felt like they belonged.
Amazing. Thanks so much for sharing that, Mo. We've actually had a comment come through while you've been on, saying somebody who'd be really interested to know which school that was at, because the person in the question has a large Roma population at their school. I don't know if you're able to share, or if you have a case study written up of this. Are you able to share their name right now?
I do have a case study. I'm happy to share after I've had permission from the school to do so, which I can do. So if I can gain kind of permission from the school, I'm happy to share with any literature you send out afterwards.
Fantastic, thank you. Just moving on to some audience questions now. We've had one question and I'm going to read out, and then panelists, please feel free to put up your hand if you'd like to take this question. The question says, so working in a school up to year 4, we're looking at our pedagogy in Key Stage 2 and considering moving to the child-led inquiry-based learning approach to help with engagement. We are in an area of significantly high deprivation and need, and we're seeing a big decline in pupil happiness and engagement before they move on to middle school. Is our curriculum too knowledge-based and teacher-led? Bennie and Steve would both like to come. Bennie, can I ask you first?
I think there's a real danger in lurching from one extreme to another. You know, we've looked at the research around the impact upon knowledge-led upon children on knowledge-led curriculum. There's nothing wrong with knowledge-led curriculum models, just as there's nothing wrong with inquiry-based models. But what happens is that if you tend to, just sit in either of those buckets, you miss the fertile middle ground that really comes with mixing and matching. I've been writing a book on the research of Graham Nuttall, The Hidden Lives of Learners, and he's very clear that it's not about the teaching method. It's very much about the immediate teacher engagement within that lesson, the exposure to full sets of knowledge 3 to 4 times, recognizing that the social lives of peers will have a massive impact on the way they learn. So I would think very carefully before you abandon a system and move to sort of the opposite end, if you like, and think about what sits in the middle and works for your children. Because I think that to me is more meaningful pedagogy, I think.
Thanks, Bennie. Steve, did you have anything to add to that?
I think this is an example of where it's useful to think about those 3 needs in self-determination theory. So what a more inquiry-led curriculum might do, if it's delivered well, is give that sense of autonomy, because you get a real purpose, like we're working towards a particular project or we're working towards a particular outcome that's clear from the beginning to all the students. So they're not left thinking, why am I learning this? Like, what's the relevance of it? The relevance is always made clear through that curriculum. But what you may lose in a kind of project-based or inquiry-led curriculum is you may lose the development of competence, or you may compromise the development of competence, because we have probably stronger evidence to say that more teacher-led or knowledge-rich approaches are likely to foster competence more effectively, and that kind of knowledge base comes from cognitive science. So I think Bennie's point about being clear, first of all, about what the issue is this about autonomy? Is it about competence? Is it about relatedness, or is it all 3? And then thinking how you would address those different elements in different aspects of school life, rather than kind of putting all your eggs in one basket of making a huge and disruptive change to your teaching, which as like a different side effect may also increase the likelihood that you'll lose some of your teachers who have really good relationships with the kids. So yeah, there may be some unintended consequences.
Thanks, Steve. I think we've probably got time for one more question. So I'm going to read out 2, and panelists, please feel free to put your hands up and answer either one of them, just so we've covered all the themes. One question is about how we engage specifically disruptive students. And then there's another 2 questions which are about children who've stopped attending. So one is just how can we re-engage children who've stopped attending, and another one mentions how do we do this in an environment we've got so many agencies who are not talking to each other or linking together. So when you've got a student not coming into school, does anybody want to come in on that? Brilliant, Mo, thank you.
How much time do we have? So I'm going to try and keep this succinct. This is really about professional development, and I think if we invest in kind of whole staff, especially when we're talking about children who are finding it difficult to engage in their learning, who perhaps are dysregulated in school, and that creates quite challenging interactions. I think we need to really think about kind of how do we invest as a school in whole staff professional development to ensure that all staff feel confident in their practice when they're engaging with students. And sometimes we just assume that staff have that skill. I remember staff saying to me, you're just so natural, aren't you? You're so organic in the way that you can de-escalate an incident. What they didn't see was kind of me 5 years prior really struggling with that. And so it takes practice and it takes time. And if you're really deliberate about that as a school and support staff and coach staff in their practice to be able to de-escalate incidents or to be able to engage in a way that engages students, I think for the majority of the time, you'll be able to respond to some of those initial challenges. It won't happen every single time. It's not a silver bullet, but I think that investment in professional development is key. In terms of kind of severely absent students, what you do have there is kind of the need to have kind of much more multi-agency support. If you do have an internal provision can be a real good bridge into ensuring students feel that that transition can be really helpful and sensitive for them, so that they can transition back into school. But if we're thinking about persistently absent students, then it's maximizing the time that we have with them when they are in school. These are children who are in school more times than they're not. And so what do we do with them when they're here? How do we feel like they're welcome, they're needed, they feel validated, they feel engaged? And again, that's very much around our kind of relational literacy and what our relational literacy looks like in our school to help us in those conversations.
Thanks, Mo. That was fantastic. Can I just ask you to explain what you mean by relational literacy before we end?
Of course, yeah. So I guess the language that we use that feels much more relational. So it helps us build relationships. It helps us to repair relationships where they may have broken down. It helps us to support students to not just students, actually, families as well as other staff to feel much more regulated. And so it's the language that we use that helps us build those relationships and sustain those relationships with our wider school community.
Thank you. Do you have one example of how you might use words in a kind of a non-example of what you might not want to say, and an example of how to do it well?
Cath, you put me right.
I know,
Right
I've put you on the spot.
No, I've got one. I've got one. So, for example, and I'm using one that when I was a leader in school, a member of staff told me this really works for them. So, you've got that student, every time they come to your class, you have to remind them of the lesson prior, how it was a struggle previously, how we want to avoid that this time coming into the lesson. And this used to be their kind of usual tact, and found that it just never really worked. And I can understand why, because essentially what you're telling that child is all the things that they got wrong previously, and there are no solutions there. There's nothing to kind of work with. And what she did after some training, kind of whole school training that I delivered, was reframe how she asked her question. And rather than asking, do you remember what happened last time? It all went wrong. Get it better this time. It was, do you know that when you do X, Y, and Z, we have a really productive session, and I really value when you do this in my lesson. And she found that actually this was much more positive. It wasn't a perfect lesson, but actually hadn't removed the student from the lesson as she would generally have to do. So it's that kind of reframing around reminding students what they can do rather than what they can't do, because there's nothing much you can do with what you can't do. Lots more when you're reminded what you can.
Thank you. Really helpful. Fantastic. Well, I'm afraid I'm going to have to wrap up the discussion there. But thank you so much to all of our panelists for your contributions today. I've really enjoyed the discussion, and I hope everybody watching has as well. Just before we close, I wanted to very quickly tell you about two programmes that Ambition has on how to lead on behaviour in schools, which touch on many of today's points. The first of these are MPQ. This is a 12-month programme for teachers who lead on behaviour and support pupil wellbeing in their schools. I won't read through all this information on the slide, but the key things for you to know that will help you gain experience and expertise in behaviour management and discover how to create a culture where all your staff and pupils can thrive. The deadline for our next cohort of this problem is in less than a week, on Tuesday, the 18th of March. We also have one other programme, a very Ambition's very own new 10-week programme called Build Pupil Engagement and Belonging. It's designed to be completed by pairs, one middle leader and one senior leader from each setting. Using 40 years of self-determination theory, as explained a little bit by Steve today, this programme will help you to analyse the strengths and limitations of your school's current approach to building pupil engagement. And you can register interest in our next cohort on our website. Finally, one slide that summarises all the programmes Ambition has to offer with a QR code to view them online. Don't worry, we'll also be sending links around in the follow-up email to the webinar. We've got programmes for teachers and leaders across all levels, from trainees to CEOs, covering a range of topics, so do have a look through. And our final slide of the day is QR code links for all of our panelists' resources, which will also be emailed to you after the webinar. So we've got links for Steph to the report that Steph presented to us, the interim findings from her research. We've got a link to Steve's recent research on pupil engagement, which is free to download. The Inclusive Leadership course, which Mohamed leads on, is on the bottom left. And then bottom right is Bennie's recently published book, The Diverse Curriculum, which you can buy on Amazon. So we'll post a recording of today's webinar on YouTube and send a link to everyone who's attended very soon. The email we'll send will contain the links to all our panelists' resources, which are currently on screen. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really pleased with the amount of interest this topic has generated, and we hope you found the session useful. Have a great evening.